Foundation's been laid. So we looked at the Exodus motif. We've looked at its individual parts. This glass of water is brilliant. Foundation laid. Now I just want to get a quick introduction about some ideas and principles before we move on to looking at some texts and looking at ways in which the Exodus reaches out into the rest of the Bible and influences it. The first thing I need to mention is really about this, what I'm doing now, to talk about a little bit more about the principles of what I'm doing now. This is something which is a field which has been stimulated very much from Israel, and it's an idea of inner biblical interpretation. Inner biblical interpretation, and all of the three main individuals who have really spearheaded things and got things moving in this area. They're all Jewish scholars, Yair Zakovich and Benjamin Summer and Michael Fishbane. And they've begun this idea of the Bible interpreting itself. Relatively new field in research, relatively new focus. And the ideas behind it are kind of contrary to what we think. We tend to think that the Old Testament, in relation to the Old and New Testaments, we think the Old Testament was written, and then as soon as it was closed, last book written, now everybody said, wow, let's start interpreting it, and then from that we get the New, and we see lots of connections between the New Testament and the Old Testament all the time. When we talk about inner biblical interpretation, we have to think that this process of seeing an older tradition or a text and developing it begins way before the New Testament ever came around, way before any Second Temple literature came around. From the time the Exodus it happened, and call me old-fashioned, but I believe it did happen, actually historically, that's relatively old-fashioned. But to say that it did, from the time it actually happened, and from that point on, people are beginning to interpret it. They're beginning to use it to teach. They're beginning to use it to show their opinion. They're going to be using it to validate their work. And because it was such an early stage on, it does reach out into every corner of the Bible. But this idea of interpretation with a text or an idea is somebody might add a little bit to it. Somebody might miss something out when they're retelling it. We're going to see that too. Somebody might alter slightly the way in which an event actually happened for their purpose. This process begins very, very early on in biblical literary history. A principle which you need to be aware of concerning this is something called allusion, a biblical allusion. Rabbinically, they call it remez. And this is the idea that you can more than just say something, but I can say something and make a statement and almost control your mind and cause you to think about something else to lend validation to what I'm saying. And I know I'm getting all mystic on you, so let me explain. If I come home, I get to the school, let's say I'm driving in my car, and this has actually happened a couple of times. If I drive in my car to pick up my daughter from school and it's raining and she's been standing out in the rain for 10 minutes because I'm late, because I was held up, because Jerusalem traffic is like that. If that happens and my daughter says to me, Abba, you're late again. Why are you late? Then I would feel bad. I would feel suitably inadequate as a father. And then I'd have to take her, obviously, to the candy store and make up for it. And that's how we do it. Now, if I were to get there, see her out in the rain, and she would turn around to me and say, Abba, why have you forsaken me? Now all of a sudden I've controlled you. I've made you think of something else. I've made you think of Jesus on the cross. I've made you think of the pain and suffering of Jesus on the cross. And I have used that, and that thought you are applying to this situation. This is a biblical allusion. This is a biblical allusion. Now, if I use those words and you don't know the story of Jesus on the cross, my story still counts. But when you do know it, you have an extra dimension, you have an extra flavor, if you like, of the things which I've said, a new dimension. And this is something that the biblical authors do all of the time. In order for it to work, though, you have to know the original tradition. You have to know the Bible to get more out of it. And I think that's the challenge which we all have right now, knowing more and more and more. So that's one thing I need to mention, because these principles will apply to some of the texts I'm dealing with. The other thing, as I check the time, good. The other thing is this idea, particularly concerning the Exodus, of remembrance. Of remembrance. It's one of the verbs that surrounds this whole tradition. Did I say remembrance? When I say remembrance, let's call it biblical remembrance. Because remembrance can work on at least two levels. I can remember walking on a beach in Eilat very vividly with my family, with it's like 103 degrees breeze coming in from the sea. I love that kind of thing, and I enjoy it. And I can think of that, and we can say that is a memory, and I remembered something. This is not biblical remembrance. Biblical remembrance, unfortunately, it comes in this word, zachar, to remember, has an implication. You remember to do. We remember to do, to act. Remembrance, biblical remembrance, is a motivation and a seed for action, to change your behavior. Deuteronomy, I'm going to mention Deuteronomy 5:15, 60, Deuteronomy 16:12, Deuteronomy 24:18. A number of times, God says, you will remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. What is God saying? Does he want them to get all nostalgic? No. He's saying, think back to when you were a slave and make that change your behavior with the way you relate to others. Critical. Critical. With the Exodus motif, it is critical. Think back to where you came from and let that be a motivation to change. In the book of Genesis, we have this case with I'm just going to quote this example. I could go on like this forever. This is, it's another sidetrack, another track. But when we look at the case of Joseph and the cupbearer, the king's cupbearer, for about, whatever it was, 10, 20 years, it says that the king's cupbearer did not remember Joseph. What is it saying? Is it saying that the king's cupbearer didn't think about Joseph for all that time? He left prison and totally forgot about Joseph? No, that's not what it's saying. It's saying that he didn't think about him and act on it and do what he said he was going to do. That's the component of remembrance which is frequently forgotten. So that idea of remembrance, real biblical remembrance as well, is key to this idea of the Exodus motif. And by intertwining all of this motif in the whole of the Bible, one of the things the biblical authors do is that they preserve the memory of what happened. They give you tentacles all the way back to what happened, because what happened back here, the story which we've gone through in the first session, is so important. It's so critical to knowing it and understanding it and helping it to control what you do, what you say, and where you go. So those ideas mentioned, we're going to go to our first example, first use of the Exodus, if you like. Well, I'll say first use, but it's not strictly true. Where do we first go? What place do we go to first? Logic would suggest that the first place we would go is someplace outside, going beyond the book of Exodus. The Bible isn't always logical. So we're going to go not forward, but we're going to go backwards. We're going to go backwards to the book of Genesis. And we're going to turn, I'm going to read some verses from Genesis. Chapter 12 from verse 10 through to 13:2. And right now I'm going to do something that I hope it's not really abhorrent and insulting or frightening to you, but I'm going to do something revolutionary. I'm going to, in this one story, I'm going to cross a chapter divide in your Bibles, and I'm going to count it all at one story, even though I break into chapter 13, which is quite revolutionary. Of course, bearing in mind that the Hebrew Scriptures were never written with any of these ridiculous chapter divisions anyway, and it was all seen as being one continuous narrative. We see that quite clearly from the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is just one continuous narrative. Psalms are just one continuous narrative, one after the other. And to separate them, there are other means for actually doing that from a literary point of view. So let's look at this story here. Now, there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass, when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai, his wife, "Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore, it will happen, when the Egyptians see you, that they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you." So it was, when Abraham came into Egypt, that the Egyptians saw the woman, and she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Abraham well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys and camels. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abraham's wife. And Pharaoh called Abraham and said, "What is it you've done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now, therefore, here's your wife. Here, take her and go away." So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Then Abraham went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, with Lot with him, to the south. And Abraham was very rich in livestock, in silver, and gold. This story here in Genesis tells us about this one man, Abraham, and his experiences. What do we have? First of all, we have Abraham going down into Egypt. Why? Because there was a severe famine in the land. That's how we began. Israel goes down to Egypt because of the famine in the land. That's what Jacob did. That's what we saw in Exodus. Whilst he's in Egypt, his life is threatened. Abraham's life, he feels his life is threatened. He knows this because he says to Sarah, "Sarah, say that you are my sister so that there I don't get killed." And we see even more. We see this phrase, "and they will let you live." This is the same phrase back in Exodus that says when Pharaoh said, if the child is a male child, you will kill him, but if it's a woman, you will let her live. It's the same thing, exactly the same thing that we see here. He fears for his life. In this case too, the means, or one of the means in which Abraham is saved is via a woman. In Exodus, I raised that point to you about the midwives and about Pharaoh's daughter. And through the women, once again, there is a degree of rest, there is a degree of salvation, if you like, or deliverance, which comes through to the individual. So women play a significant part of what's going on. With Abraham, we see that Pharaoh who is the oppressor, is plagued. His family is plagued. I'm watering this down for you because the Hebrew is very, very clear on this. Naga, we see this root, lingoa, naga, which means to plague, to touch, or to smite. It's the same phrase that we see in Exodus concerning the plague of the firstborn. So we see this Pharaoh as well is plagued on account of the threat, if you like, that he's causing Abraham. Back in Exodus, we see that the Egyptians and Pharaoh is plagued on account of what they were doing to the Israelites. We go down, we see this, an intervention of God, if you like, that causes the deliverance. A supernatural intervention of God that enabled both Abraham to be delivered and also the Israelites. And when Abraham leaves, he comes out with much silver and gold. When the Israelites leave Egypt, they come out with a great deal of silver and gold. All the way back here in Genesis, I think the parallels are clear. The big difference being, Abraham is somehow embodying or representing the people of Israel. What happens to him is like a foreshadow, a foretaste of what is going to happen to the children of Israel. One man embodying a nation. Another big important principle we have in biblical literature. We're going to hit on this again later on in the third session. But one man representing the nation. I would hope that from our Christian backgrounds, we know of one man. We know of this whole idea of Adam being the federal head, representing mankind, if you like. So this idea of the many representing the one, or the one, the many, shouldn't really come as any surprise to us. So he goes through us. He goes through the whole situation that the Israelites do. He recounts almost. He relives the whole Exodus tradition. This is one way in which the Bible reuses the Exodus tradition. A story will be cast in such a way, and if you think in terms of Moses, again, let's just have fun and play with the ideas, but if you think of Moses writing Genesis and forming it in an experience which he has just gone through, it's really kind of neat. It's really kind of nice, if you like. But that's just one way in which it happens. You've got parallel accounts that match up with something or a sequence of events in the Exodus tradition. A further connection, just staying with Exodus for a while, a further connection can also be made in Exodus 15. This is a shorter case. Genesis 15. A case in which God is reaffirming his promise to Abraham. It's more of a promise than a covenant. And God actually prophesies to Abraham. Genesis 15:13. God said to Abraham, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. There they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I also will judge the nation whom they will serve. And afterward, they will come out with many possessions." So you've got, concerning Abraham, he lives the Exodus, going through what they go through, and it's also prophesied to him. God is also telling him exactly what's going to happen and how it's going to happen. So that's the connection. That's just one thing which I mentioned because it's very interesting because it happens before we even get to the Exodus tradition. There's a foreshadow, a forerunner of it. Another example I want us to look at, a brief example, occurs in 1 Kings 12:25-33. This is a passage. This is the monarchy, the Just after David sets up his kingdom, we know about David, we know of Solomon, his son. Kingdom's established, it's as big as it ever got. And then after Solomon comes Solomon's son, Rehoboam, who is a cruel leader and wants to place more burdens and restrictions on the Israelites. And he does that, and when he does that, an upstart general, Jeroboam, comes and becomes leader of 10 tribes, and they divide the country up into the north and the south. And this is really the beginning of the end, if you like, the demise of the nation, so to speak. So you've got this split between the north and the southern parts of the country, and they almost operate as politically independent units. Now, when this happens, Jeroboam, he's got a problem. He's got a problem because he's saying, I want nothing to do with the south. But the center for worship, Jerusalem, is in the south. Now he's got a problem. So if his people want to worship God, they have to keep going up to Jerusalem. When they go up to Jerusalem, the center, they come under the influence of the south, and it's there doctrines begin to spread, dissension begins, and he is going to lose his people. He is going to be hearing other stories. He's going to be hearing how good it is. They're going to be hearing how good it is in Judah to live, and there are going to be other stories going on, other political tensions wrought because of that. What does he do? To stop the situation, he creates his own worship centers, and he establishes 2 golden calves, one in the north up in near Banyas in Dan, and the other down in the south in Bethel. And he says, this is where you need to go to worship. So now the northern kingdom can worship wherever they want and stay in the country without crossing the border down south. This is what he does to maintain his kingdom. This is the sin of Jeroboam. And in Kings, you read about it all the time. The sin of Jeroboam. And it's the worshiping at these 2 sites. Now, if that wasn't repulsive, what is truly repulsive and what is strong and what the authors here have done that add strength to this story are the words in Kings 12, 1 Kings 12:28, that Jeroboam says. He creates the 2 calves, and what does he say? Hear, O Israel, are the gods who brought you up from Egypt. Do you remember that? Aaron. Here are the gods who brought you up from Egypt. That is what he is saying. That is what, when you read the story and you're saying the calf, that's bad enough. But now he is doing exactly the same thing that Aaron has done. Once you know the Exodus story, you can make that connection. The dimension is added of the repulsive, ridiculous, rebellious behavior of this king, and why this sin of Jeroboam sticks so much in the throats of God and sticks so much in the throats of the writers of the book of Kings. So that's just a classic allusion. Words are taken. You have to be careful about this because you have to find words and phrases that only appear in a couple of places. And those are the ones you really want to latch onto. Sometimes you will find, we'll see a couple more, sometimes you will find very unique phrases, quite unique phrases, rare phrases, and you say, well, wow, where else does that occur? And when that happens frequently, the author, the writer of the book is saying, hey, you guys, look down here for more meaning. Connect these 2 stories together. They want you to do that. They want you to do that. The Bible is not, as we are commonly taught to think, first rule of exegesis hermeneutics, select a passage, make that passage independent, and separate it from everything else. And that's one stage, but we should never end there. The Bible was written that everything is linked together. Everything is connected. There are no independent units. And so we have to know the whole thing, otherwise we suffer. So keep that in mind. Never forget, if you find something, if you find a hint or something, follow that up and see where it goes. So you've got this, that's a case of allusion, an allusion to one instance, a little phrase that connects, that it adds a degree of depth, if you like. We're going to move on to another instance, another use of the Exodus motif, and another clever usage. The book of Isaiah. Book of Isaiah, chapter 48. Brief passage from there. I want to bring that up in, again, more background. I'm hearing my wife's voice, but they don't know that. So I have to keep going back here. I spoke briefly about the kingdom of the split of the kingdom between Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and we have the two kingdoms coming down, filtering down, and all of a sudden in 722, the northern kingdom is exiled, and that's where we had the whole idea of the 10 lost tribes, and we've got the kingdom of Judah, it comes down, and in the end, in 586 BC, we have the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, which I'm going to assume you know of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. I think you may have heard of it before, and the exile into Babylon. In all my time in Israel, every class I went to, the exile was mentioned. We can never underestimate the damage, the revolution caused by the exile. We speak about it at terms. It's a couple of verses in the Bible, but it was enormous. It shifts everything. Think about it. The Babylonians came. They wrecked the holy city where God put his name. They stole Israel's God. God dwells between the cherubim, the Ark of the Covenant. That's where his presence was concentrated. That's gone. The promises to David about a son of his would always be on the throne, gone. How do you relate to that? The promises to Abraham of living in the land, gone, because you're exiled to Babylon. The effects are enormous. The effects also, to those who are paying attention to Scripture, echo throughout Scripture. And you have a clear divide between what we call First Temple literature and to Second Temple literature, because theology changes in Second Temple literature. You have to reconstruct your faith. You literally have to reconstruct your faith. This is something which is dear to my heart because it's something I had to do. My second year in Israel, coming from a relatively conservative Christian background, understanding of the Scriptures, and all of a sudden I'm thrust into a much more liberal focus on Christianity, and things are challenged. Things which I believed and I'm sure were very certain were challenged. And I had to go through a process, which I tell you was difficult, of reconstructing and asking myself the question, what is really important in my faith? What matters? How do I understand God? What matters and what doesn't matter? And that was really important for me. And I can only imagine that after the exile, the Israelites had to go through the same thing. They had to say, what is important? How do we relate to God? How do we build our faith again? How do we address this God? What is his relationship to us? Has he kicked us out forever? If not, then how do we get back into his good books? So all of these questions, all of these issues arise. None less, of course, than what's going on in Isaiah. This part of Isaiah addresses the situation when Israel was in exile. They were out there, and it had been, however many years, and Isaiah here is prophesying of their return, that they're going to come back. And this is, in itself, is huge. He says there is going to be a return. How does he describe that? Isaiah 48, 20 to 22. Go forth from Babylon, That's where they were. Flee from the Chaldeans. Declare the sound of joyful shouting. Proclaim this. Send it out to the end of the earth. Say, the Lord has redeemed his servant Jacob. They did not thirst when he led them through the deserts. He made the water flow out of the rock for them. He split the rock and water gushed forth. Where does that language come from? Back to the Exodus. Isaiah is describing a return from exile in terms of the Exodus, because that is very much the situation was in. In the same way that the Israelites hadn't reached the land and were living in exile in Egypt, if you like, is the same way that they were living in Babylon, exiled and without their land. And God, through Isaiah, is prophesying this as though it's going to be as miraculous as that. It is going to be as important. It is going to be as significant as what happened there. And the Israelites took this idea on. The trip from Babylon to back to Israel, back to the land of Judah, the province of Judah as it was very much seen and is cast in terms of the Exodus, without a shadow of a doubt. We have, just before, we read this in the book of Ezra, just before the Israelites leave Babylon, what do they receive? Articles of silver and gold from the temple. That's what the king gives them back. So it's like they're leaving this captivity. They are getting these articles. They're leaving again with silver and gold, with riches again that God is giving them, and they're going back to the land. There is definitely a feel, if you like, of divine protection and coverage on this as well. There was a passage, did I write this down? I wrote down the Ezra 1:7. Cyrus the king also brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the house of his gods. Cyrus, king of Persia, brought these out in the charge of Mithredath, the treasurer, who counted them out, Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. And this was the number of them, 30 basins of gold, 1,000 basins of silver. I'm not going to go any further. We've got our gold and silver, which the Israelites are heavy in going out. We also have this idea of divine help. We've got this passage in 8:22. Ezra recalls, and I love this passage. For I was ashamed to request from the king troops and horsemen to protect us from the enemy on the way. And I want you just to think about this for a moment. You are traveling from Babylon, and you are going to Judah. You are traveling about 3 months. You are walking, and you are carrying a bunch of silver and gold. It's like you have a target on your back. It is like you have a target. You're bringing all of this money. You're saying, rob me, please. That's what you're saying. It is dangerous. He understands that. The king offers help. He says no. He was ashamed to do it. Why? Because Ezra said to the king, the hand of our God is favorably disposed to all those who seek him. His power and his anger are against all who forsake him. So Ezra is saying, I'm not going to take your help because God is going to watch us. And I'll tell you, they wouldn't have made it otherwise. They had no chance of making it otherwise unless there was some kind of protection, because that is a heck of a lot of money, a heck of a lot of valuables that they were actually carrying. So you've got a divine leading from Babylon through to the province of Judah. And then we also have this case as well of what happens when he gets to the land. We've got this idea: if this is a new Exodus, who is the new Moses? Well, of course, it has to be Ezra. In Nehemiah 8:2, then Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly of men, women, and all who could listen with understanding on the first day of the 7th month, he read from it before the square, which was in front of the water gate, from early morning until midday, in the presence of men and women, and those who could understand. All the people were attentive to the book of the law. So we get there and we find the first thing he does is he expounds or he speaks or he preaches on the book of the law. The whole question of Ezra, who interprets biblical law, we're not going to go there, but he interprets biblical law beautifully in an amazing way. That's pretty much the first act, one of the first early acts he does when he gets to the land. And this mimics what Moses does when they get to the borders of the promised land. What does he do? He pulls out the Bible and he begins to preach. You have to understand something. The book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy, they have a lot of similarities and overlap, but they are not the same. The book of Exodus, when you read the laws being read, they come from God's mouth. The book of Deuteronomy is Moses preaching God. It's Moses expounding the word of God when God said to you. This is the first biblical sermon. This is the first biblical. Don't listen to the New Testament guys. They're liars. This is the first biblical sermon that we have in the Old Testament. It's Moses expounding Deuteronomy to the people once again before they enter the land. And it's the same thing that we have with Ezra when he gets there too. So we've got this in order to help the people understand, put things in perspective. We have a case of the return from exile being framed, being captured, and being told in the same format as the deliverance from Egypt. It is to be deemed as a miraculous event. It is to be deemed as a highly significant event. And in the same way God was able to do one, yes, he can do the other as well. Staying in the Old Testament, I want to go to the book of Psalms, and this is where I need the most restraint. My dissertation, I actually have a copy of the book, was I'm shamelessly advertising, and I am ashamed. But my dissertation was published from Bards to Biblical Exegetes, and I chose 5 Psalms and looked at how they treated the Exodus motif, and that's what it was all about. It's very close reading. It's very, very dull and very, very boring, actually. But that's what you do for a PhD. But that's what it's about. So I have to now. I really have to be careful because I have to try and make it less dull for you as you read it. But as I go through that, I want to look at a couple of Psalms that deal with the Exodus motif. We're going to do that, and then I think we'll take a second break. But the Exodus is all over the Psalter. Absolutely all over the Psalter. You can make a note. Psalm 77, 78, 95, 105, 106, 114, 135, 136. Those are the major cases in which it occurs, but it is also, images are also, allusions are also made in many other books in the Psalter. We have to be aware of book 4 in the Psalter as well, and I wrote a small excursus about this. When scholars always have little pet things, say I really must write that up and develop that more into something else, and they never ever do. So this was one of my projects like that. But book 4 of the Psalter, the Psalter is basically divided up into 5 books. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the division of book 4 is Psalm 90 through to 106. And that is one book of the Psalter, and book 5 is 107 through to the end. And book 1 is, I think, 1 to 42, and I can't remember the other 2 divisions offhand. But it's divided into 5 books. This book 4 of the Psalter, I began arguing, is the book of Moses. We call it the book of Moses because within this, you've got a lot of ideas, Exodus ideas, appearing in it. At the beginning of the book, in Psalm 90, we read, this is a psalm of Moses. A psalm of Moses that we see in Psalm 90 that opens it up, and it makes reference to the wilderness, subtle references to the wilderness period. We also see Psalm 95, which is an Exodus psalm within that corpus of literature. And we also read of Psalm 105 and 106, very much Exodus psalms within that short concentration. We also see something very, very important within this collection of psalms, and that's in we're dealing about Psalm 94 through to 99 for sure. These are a special collection of psalms called kingship psalms, psalms that have the statement, God is king. God is king. That's incredibly relevant to the Exodus, because during the Exodus, up until the reign properly of David, Israel was a theocracy. Israel was ruled by God. He was their king, he was their ruler. And he had a prophet to speak his message to the people. And this was replaced by the monarchy with the Davidic dynasty. But before that, it was a much closer relationship. And I would add as well, it was the relationship after the exile that the Israelites craved once again. Now that the kingship was gone, they wanted God again as their king. They want to look back to that desert model where he rules them, where we're not going to have all these problems of being led astray with any kind of human monarchy, if you like. So you've got all of these aspects concentrated into that small book. And it's the end of that small book of Moses. The last two Psalms I actually want to take a brief look at and discuss briefly. Well, relatively briefly anyway. Psalm 105 is the first one. Psalm 105, it's a hymn. We call it a hymn of praise, according to Herman Gunkel's definition of Psalms. And it's a psalm, one of those psalms, I think, that is severely mishandled and misused. I'll probably say that about a lot of psalms, but I think this one in particular. It's a hymn of praise, and it speaks about God intervening through history to help save and deliver his people. And it talks about the Exodus. It brings the Exodus in. We're going to go through the sections it touched on in just a moment. But it talks about the Exodus, but it talks about God intervening, delivering, intervening with the patriarchs and saving them, intervening in the story of Joseph and saving them, intervening with the Israelites and saving them, and all that he did to intervene in history to deliver his people. And it's very much in that sense, it's a psalm of rejoicing and it's a psalm of praise. And that is how it is desperately taken right out of context, because we use it as a hymn of praise. I sing songs, give thanks to the Lord, call upon his name, make known among the nations what he has done. And it's about praise. And that's wonderful. I have nothing against praise. But the last verse is not so much about praise. Yes, God has intervened in history. He has delivered us, that they might observe his statutes and keep his laws. Yes, he did it. Yes, we should sing and praise about it. Yes, he's wonderful. But it has another side. This is the small print, biblical small print, that we never see. So small. We just kind of go straight past it. We just take the good parts of it without any kind of obligation whatsoever. So that's the context of the whole psalm. That's what it's about. I don't want to talk about the first section is just praise, inviting people to praise, and it sets the scene of the Abrahamic covenant of the land. And at the end, it begins with the promise of land, and it ends with when they enter the land to show how God is faithful. I'm not going to go too much into that. It speaks about Abraham. It speaks about the instance we talked about when Abraham lied and said that, or told Sarah to lie, and God intervened to deliver them. It speaks of those situations, and it speaks about Joseph. This is the only psalm that properly speaks of what happens to Joseph. And that he was incarcerated and delivered by God's intervention. So it speaks of all of those things, and as part of that theme, if you like, of God's deliverance of Israel, it comes down to the Exodus. And in verse 23, it mentions the descent of Jacob and his sons into Egypt. In verse 24 is a mention of their multiplication. 25, we see the changing of the Egyptians' hearts, so they go against God's people. We've got the sending of Aaron and Moses once again in verses 26 and 27. We've got the plagues mentioned in 28 to 36. And we've got the riches that they received, this silver and gold, something again it's not mentioned much, but it comes out again and again and again whenever the Exodus is recited. It's almost a partial validation of what's going on, saying this is part of the Exodus motif. And then we've got protection in the wilderness, guidance. We've got the bread and the meat story as well, verse 40 and verse 41. We've got waters in the desert too. All of these are clearly Exodus motifs, and I don't think I'm going to stand out on a limb to say there is a connection to the Exodus here. There is a retelling of the Exodus tradition here. We have a problem. Royal we. I have to include myself. Everybody has a problem. When we read duplicate material or when we come across a piece of literature that is vaguely kind of familiar, we switch off. We switch off and we think, I've read this, I know this. And we switch off. And this is problematic, highly problematic. We do it typically, we definitely do it with Chronicles, Kings, and Samuel. Chronicles, Kings, and Samuel. Nobody reads Chronicles. Why? Because it's said in Kings and Samuel already. It's old news, old hat. We've done it before. Seen it, done it. We don't do it. And we don't read it. And biblical authors weep in their graves when that happens because they know that they've borrowed material. They know there's literary borrowing. What they are hoping for is that you will know the other tradition, the earlier tradition. Definitely. The author of Chronicles, he's not writing thinking, they don't know anything about Samuel and Kings. They'll never know if I just change things. He knows they know those traditions, and he's still rewriting it. He wants people. He's inviting you. He's saying, yeah, look at this, look at that. See the differences that are made and learn from them. See what's going on. Understand what's going on. And it's the same thing going on here with this Exodus tradition. I could have left what I had said alone and said that those were connections to the Exodus tradition. But that's not it. That's the first stage. We now have to look and ask the question, what's different? Because that's where we learn. That's where we learn about what this poet, this so-called poet, is actually doing. That's the title of my book, from bards, poets, to biblical exegetes. And I'm trying to cross this boundary between we see poetry and then we see biblical exegesis as two separate things, but they come together very much in the Psalms. They transform, they overlap, to say the least. So looking again, just a couple of instances here in this particular psalm, and we start seeing some changes. One of the changes we see straight away, I hope you see, is when we went through the Exodus this morning, when I laid my foundation down, there was complaining by the Israelites. Every opportunity, the giving of bread at the sea, every opportunity to complain. In the psalmist retelling, nothing. Squeaky clean. Nothing bad appears about the Israelites. They acted perfectly in every situation. They never complained. They never whined. They never rebelled. Everything was fine. They asked for water, and he said, yeah, sure, here it is. Is that the way it happened? Is that really the way it happened? Clearly not. The psalmist knows that you know the real tradition, but he is taking one aspect of it. He's looking at it through this lens to do what he wants it to do. And he wants to point out the aspects of praise from another situation. It's really wise. We can learn from that type of thing too, because we can go through situations and we can look at the horrible disaster of it all, or we can just grab, well, what went right in that situation? Let me grab those things and bring those things out as a means by which I can praise God. And that's what the psalmist is doing. And that's in one level, that's very much what he's teaching us to do. If we read between the lines and we see what's actually going on. So that's a nice, subtle change that he makes. Another change. Don't know if you noticed the number of plagues. Yes, he recounts the plagues, but how many plagues does he recount? Is it the 10 that we saw in Exodus? No. On my count, it is 7. On my count, it is 7. I do that with a little bit of, not trickery, but you've got verse 31 is the trick one, where it says, he spoke and there came swarms of flies, as it is in this Bible, lice in all their territory. I read that as one plague, because I told you before, swarms are not flies. Swarms are a clustering, a mixing of various creatures, but they do not have to be flies. So I understand this very much as being the lice were the swarming things, and this way we get the number 7. Why am I fighting desperate to get the number 7? I get the number 7 because 7 and 10 are important numbers in biblical literature. And I think the psalmist knew that as well. 7 and 10, they're important, and they're also interchangeable. They're numbers that represent a degree of completion, perfection, finality, if you like. Just to show you that, I want to just direct your attention real quick to the book of Ruth. Ruth 4:15, and we find an expression, a biblical saying, that obviously is around in earlier days, and it's about, let's read it. May he, which is an individual, which is Ruth's child, may he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age for your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons. Is better to you than 7 sons. So this is talking about a child that's born that is better to someone than 7 sons. This is clearly an expression. 7 sons meaning a perfect amount of sons. If you go to Samuel 1:8, 1 Samuel 1:8, you see the same expression with a slight difference. Am I not better to you, this is what Elkanah says to Hannah, am I not better to you than 10 sons? So the expression is clearly there, being better than X amount of sons, but there's an exchange between 7 and 10. The two numbers are exchangeable, and the two numbers do both represent, if you like, a perfect amount. So we've got a change in the number of plagues that are actually mentioned within the psalm versus what's going on in Exodus. But you've also, and I'm sure you've realized that too, there's also the change in their order. The order of plagues has very much changed. Now, this has caused many people to speculate many things. It's one of the things I worked upon. I could never properly narrow down and lock in a perfect solution as to why the order was changed. One thing I do know is that the psalmist would not have changed it for fun, but would have had a logic behind it. There are two ideas taken behind it. There's one which I read about, couldn't quite get it to work, but there was one which it's quite nice, but he takes the idea of 7 and relates the idea to that of creation, 7 days of creation, including the rest. And as a result of that, one of the things we see in this order of the psalmist's order of the Psalms here is the question of darkness coming as the first plague, and the last one being the killing of the firstborn. And this echoes creation because in the beginning was this dark chaos, and from it God sorted everything out, and the final point was man being created. But instead of God creating from chaos, in the psalm, he creates to chaos. He sends chaos down to the Egyptians, and at the end, instead of him creating man in the psalm, he is destroying man. He is killing man. So in one way of looking at this change is to look at God undoing creation, creating a chaos situation in the midst of the Egyptians. Another way, which is why I sought to view it, was simply a question of an escalation. and that the psalmist is building up. He starts with the lighter plagues, darkness, and he moves more and more, gets more intense, and ends with the firstborn being killed. And this you can begin to see, because as we go into the later parts of the plague rendition, the plague of locusts, he doubles the amount of lines of verses he devotes to each plague, and so there is a degree of intensity being built up. The major point is there is a definite change in what's going on. The psalmist is interpreting the Exodus motif. He is making it work for him. He's teaching something different, a new story, giving a new emphasis from these old tools. Other things he does, quite subtle but nevertheless important. I mentioned before that in Exodus 1, chapter 1:7, but the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty. It mentions it there in Exodus as though this happened as a matter of fact. They just multiplied. This is not good enough for the psalmist, and the psalmist makes a very clever change by specifically stating in Psalm 105, he increased his people. It didn't happen by chance. God actively did it. It was miraculous. It was something very deliberate that God did, which helps explain it. And this is part of the psalmist's role in the Exodus, to elevate the position of God and put down the position of man. And we see that throughout the whole of this particular psalm. Moses and Aaron are mentioned, yes, but when the plagues are recounted, God does it. God sent this, God sent that, God sent the other. God is the one who directly sends the plague. He is the one doing business. That very much is the image, that very much is the portrayal that God wants to make in this particular work. He controls everything. He's responsible for everything. This has problems. This has huge problems. There's the idea of, I think it's verse 16, where it said he sent a famine. God sent famine? Does God send famine that causes destruction? Well, according to the psalmist, yes. And if God is omnipotent, then that must be the case. Otherwise, he's losing control. So we've got this idea of this elevation of God and the subduing of man in a context of praise, in the context of Exodus. In his recounting, God does most of these things. God is in charge and responsible for these things. And it was just really funny. I was in a library at college, and somebody asked me, "What are you doing? What are you here for?" And I was telling them, I explained to the librarian what I was doing. And I was working on this psalm, writing it. She glazed over, and she just went to another place, and I'm normally quite attentive. I can see when people just switch off from things that I'm saying, which is quite all right. Many people do it. I just learned to recognize it better. So she kind of phased off, and she goes off like this, and I'm talking, and I stop, and she turns around, and she says, yes. She says, "Isn't that it? Isn't that the problem with us in worship? We don't lift up God and put ourselves down. We lift ourselves up and put God down." She said, "Isn't that exactly it?" And I was like, wow, yeah, that happens, doesn't it? Something great and magnificent happens, and we kind of like mix ourselves up in there. But there's a lesson being told here that worship and praise is not about us. It's about God. It's about putting him up there. And that was a real lesson. That was one of those things which I read through this psalm over 1,000,000 times, and it never hit me until she actually raised that to me. And it's obviously then you start getting convicted, and you start seeing it. And I do it. I do it in classes. And a student would come up to me and said, "Professor, you really, when I went to your class, you really changed the way I think about a particular issue." And instantly, yeah, I did that. Yeah, and you do. You feel like that. But it's not, I don't do what I do. I was simply there when the wheel went round. I was simply there when God was doing a work in a student's life. And that's about it. Anything more than that is just, it's not of me. That's of the flesh. And these are the things that just need to be put down. Get on with life. Elevate God. Say what He did. If anything good happens, He did it. He brought you all here today. We put our works down. That's just a lesson, a basic lesson in praise, but that's another story. So we have this case of the Exodus, one Exodus in which Israel does everything right, and the psalmist uses certain aspects of the motif to tell a particular story, to do a particular thing, to praise God and inspire the people to works, to serve Him. Now, straight after that, we have Psalm 106. And we've got something here, again, another a fascinating topic, the juxtaposition of Scripture, particularly in the Psalms. When we read Psalms, we tend to read a psalm, and then we stop. And then we do what we do, and we read another one. And let me encourage you today, when you're reading Psalms, read between the Psalms. Read 2 Psalms at a time and go straight through. And ask yourself, what is the connection between one and the other? Because frequently there is. Frequently there is. Right here we've got a beautiful connection between one and the other, Psalm 105 and 106. They're both Exodus Psalms put next to each other. And if you take the broad history between them, they cover from the patriarchal period and they cover into the promised land and they cover a history all the way down through to the exile. So they're like 2 halves of a whole. Many people thought they were written by the same author, but I doubt that severely. So we've turned to Psalm 106, and it is a very different psalm. This psalmist who wrote this was an individual in exile. We know that from the last few verses. He was in exile. We spoke about that. Cannot be overstated, the damages of that. So he's one individual in exile praying, interceding for the nation of Israel, for the nation of Judah, the kingdom of Judah, that has been exiled out there, praying that God would have mercy on them once again. As a result of that, his view, his perspective of the psalm is very different to the guy who came before him in the Psalter. Once again, we've got Exodus motif, we've got images, we've got the deliverance from Egypt and the sea crossing in verses 7 and 11. We've got the giving of quail in 14 and 15, their desires which were met. We've got Dathan's rebellion against Moses, the company of Dathan, Abiram, and Korah. We've got the rebellion at the golden calf, verses 19 and 25. We've got the rejection of the promised land. Nice little insert which he gives there. We'll talk about that in a second. We've got the idolatry that took part, the lewd ceremonies that the Israelites did at Baal Peor in 28 to 31, with Phinehas saving the day. All of that is mentioned. There's the rebellion at Meribah, the second time, in 32 to 33. These all connect us directly with our Exodus tradition. These all are clear signs that he knows it and he's retelling it. But it's the differences. What are the things that he does? The first thing that he does, pretty much, is in opposition to the guy who was before him, Israel can do no right. Everything they do just about is wrong. It is a history of rebellion. It is a history of sin. It's a history of idolatry. It's a history of not learning. It's a history of evil and rebellion. The total swing. But it's the same Exodus tradition he is using. It is the same tradition, but he is doing something entirely different with it. Couple things we see, the glimmers of hope we see are not by Israel, but are by individuals. The 2 commendable things we see in this, verse 23, they made a calf at Horeb. This is from 19. They made a calf from Horeb and worshipped the molded image. Thus they exchanged their glory into the image of an ox that eats grass. They forgot God, their Savior, who had done great things in Egypt, wondrous works in the land of Ham, awesome things by the Red Sea. Therefore he said that he would destroy them. Had not Moses, his chosen one, stood before them in the breach to turn away his wrath, lest he destroy them. Moses' commendable action is that he stands in the gap between God and the people to intercede for them. This is intercession, standing in the gap. In verse 30, the other commendable act is Phinehas. Then Phinehas stood up and intervened, and the plague was stopped. One individual stands between God and the sinful Israelites to stop the punishment. The psalmist stands in exile between God and the Israelites, and he is confessing their sin that he would have mercy on them. He is putting himself in that same position of intercession between them. That's what's going on basically in this psalm, and that's why these two instances from the Exodus tradition stand out. They are instances in which individuals have stood up to defend or to intercede on behalf of the people. So that selection of the Exodus motif is very, very important and says quite a bit. We see also something else. We see in this case of Phinehas. Then Phinehas stood up and intervened, and the plague was stopped. And what happened? And that was accounted to him for righteousness. Psalmist is doing it right here. That was accounted to him as righteousness. Occurs in one other place. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Only other place in which it exists in the Bible. The psalmist knows what he is doing. Phinehas is being elevated to the status of Abraham. Not a covenant of peace in the original text we read, but he is being elevated to the status of Abraham. God likes Phinehas as much as he does Abraham. He appreciates Phinehas as much as he does Abraham. A classic allusion to another place, if we know where the other text actually leads us. We see, once again, I have to mention this. We hear again, we read the mention of the sin, the golden calf. Where's Aaron? Where is Aaron? He led it. Where is he? Squeaky clean. He is not mentioned. He does not appear. You know, he does not appear. Even in all of this, what the psalmist does, Moses is indicted. Moses, it goes down that the Israelites upset him. In verse 32, they angered him also at the waters of strife at Meribah, so that it went ill with Moses on account of them. So Moses suffers through this, but Aaron once again is squeaky clean. He comes out of it without any blemish. Somebody else who comes out of this quite clean, and this is something else the psalmist is doing, and all of this is interpretation, because the context of the psalmist has changed from the context of the Exodus. So he's doing these things. Something else we see, going back to Baal Peor and the idolatry that actually takes place there. In the earlier account, we have three individuals that are responsible for this. We have Abiram, we have Dathan, and we have Korah. When he's telling his story now, all of a sudden, we've got, going back up, that's the end of it. We've got in verse 17, when it speaks of the earth opening up, the earth opened up and swallowed Dathan and covered the faction of Abiram. Where's Korah? Where's Korah? Why isn't Korah mentioned? Well, Korah has to be preserved. Why does he have to be preserved? He has to be preserved because by the time of the exile, there is a school, a choral school of Korah. Psalms of the songs of Korah. He has established a school. The psalmist cannot implicate him or his family in anything bad, in anything negative. And so he receives this treatment, this avoidance, if you like, of what's going on. Said, okay, I'm not going to mention your name. Something bad went down, but no, I'm going to preserve your name in all of this, even as Aaron is actually preserved. So we've got this skipping of names. You've got changing things slightly here and there to tell his story. We've got an embellishment, if you like, certain aspects. This is a lament. And so the psalmist cannot just say one thing, bad thing. He embellishes in a number of places. He adds. We see that in verse 20. They exchanged their glory into the image of an ox that eats grass, which is not a wonderful bronze bull, but you have to imagine the picture of a cow chewing the cud. That's what it comes down to. And what exactly did they do? They exchanged their glory into the image of an ox. Right in that text, some of you might have certain versions of the Bible. The ESV does this, I believe. For one, if anyone has the ESV, you can read it. The ESV doesn't say to exchange their glory. It says to exchange his glory. And the reason why it does that is it's attempting to look beyond the scribal remarks. What we have in this particular verse, we have a phenomenon called tikkun hasoforim, the corrections of the scribes. And the scribes were very sensitive about God and about his sanctity. And if there was anything really negative that connected with God, that was associated with God, they would do what they can to try and soften it up. And so here, they are literally, the text, the Hebrew text before the correction would have said they exchanged God's glory for that of an ox chewing grass. But that has been slightly pacified by this change. It's a very small change in Hebrew by a pronominal suffix, and you don't want to know about pronominal suffixes now. I can tell by your faces, so I'm not going to say it, but it's a very subtle change that goes on that slightly alleviates the pressure. There's another wonderful instance of this as a theory. I have to back up what I'm saying. So if you go to turn to the book of Job, if you know the story of Job, an excellent case. There's a part in the book of Job in which Job's wife it says, and in the Hebrew text, Job's wife says, well, I don't know, in the English text, what does it say? Why don't you just curse God and die? Don't say that. That's too much. You can't say that. The scribes have a problem with this. The Hebrew text doesn't say that. The Hebrew text says, why don't you bless God and die? They've used the word bless because you cannot have the word curse next to God. That's abhorrent. So they make this change to help sanctify the name of God and distance the name of God. I can quote a couple other examples, but that's not what we're here for. We're here talking about the Exodus motif. So we've got a degree of embellishment going on as well. And I do need to check the time, don't I? Okay. I'm gonna wind down. So we've got this issue of tikkun, from this change that goes on as well. We've got another nice change, verse 27, that takes place. In verse 27, he's talking about the punishment, kind of an embellishment. We've got a punishment of God when they refuse to conquer the land of Israel the first time. God punishes them, and he says, in verse 26, he says, therefore he raised his hand in an oath against them to overthrow them in the wilderness. Yes, he did. And to overthrow their descendants among the nations and to scatter them in the lands. No, he did not. God never made that oath. The oath God made was that the generation who sinned in doing that would die in the desert. The first part of that is true. There was not an oath to scatter Israel across the lands. That wasn't in there. That is in there because the psalmist is drawing a connection between his situation and the Exodus and saying that for the sin, he's putting the words here saying that the sin that's going, the punishment, that's going in the was in the Exodus was through something severe, and it involved the scattering of the lands, and therefore we as Israelites in Babylon have been scattered, and we have undergone this punishment. So he is trying to make a bridge between his situation and the sinful Israelites at the beginning of the conquest. And he does that by these choice words that he's using here. I want to tell you of the connection between that and Ezekiel, but we're not going to do that. I'm going to move on. Same tradition, very, very different results. And so I'm going to, let me just draw that to a close, leaving it at Psalm 106. And I want to just bring to your mind again this idea that we are talking about one motif, the Exodus, that has been taken in two very diverse directions. The same building blocks, but very, very, very different results at the end of it. And this is, it's something that is good and it's bad, isn't it? Because the Exodus is so large and broad and it's so diverse. Individuals can come and interpret it and look at it through certain lenses and pull it out and only recognize one particular part or speak on one particular part. But the individuals in the Bible that did this know that everybody knows the tradition because it was the national tradition. The warning, obviously, from that simply comes from the Bible as a whole, because this is a generation, I feel, where we tend to do that. Because it is so broad, it is very easy to take one part of it, to pull it out, and to preach and to say, this is it. The problem there is, unfortunately, many Christians do not know the whole of the Bible, so they cannot differentiate change. They cannot differentiate what has been missed out and what hasn't. Within the context of the Bible and the Exodus, it's absolutely fine because hopefully everybody knew the tradition, they could make that distinction. But today it gets dangerous, and from the Bible, from the one motif, we can produce a message of salvation or we can produce a message of death. So we have to be very careful in the way in which we handle it. Yes, we can interpret it, but there are rules for it.
Do you have any comments or questions about this lecture? Write us, the Center, at jcstudies.com. Also, check out jcstudies.com for more teaching resources dedicated to authentic discipleship from a Hebraic perspective. Shalom.